Welcome to all of you. My name is Elger Niels, Secretary for the Rachmaninoff Network and also responsible for the content management of the future Sergei Rachmaninoff International Database. I'm happy you can join us on this occasion, which is exciting for two reasons. First and foremost, we are about to share with the world the combined inventory of three collections of printed sheet music which together make up for the major part of the sheet music Sergei Rachmaninoff owned in exile. And secondly, we are joined today by the Australian pianist and Rachmaninoff scholar Scott Davie, who recently has already received a copy of the inventory we are about to release, and who, as a compiler of Rachmaninoff's performance diary, will offer us his perspective. Scott, perhaps by way of introduction, you would like to tell us a little about your work on the performance diary and perhaps some of the highlights among your findings.
Thank you, Elke. It's wonderful to be joining you. Uh, my work on the performance diary has now lasted over 25 years. It started with a simple enough question. I was playing Rachmaninoff's first piano sonata at the time, and I wanted to know how many times he performed it. And I discovered that resources, especially in English, were very limited. That initial search went on and on. Numerous countries, numerous languages in terms of data, and I was able to compile the database, which has been online now for over a decade. Serendipitously, when I was in the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. at one time, I discovered that Rachmaninoff's sister-in-law, Sophia Satina, had actually made an effort to compile every single recital program that Rachmaninoff ever gave. It was her intention at the time, shortly after Rachmaninoff's death, to give this to the Russian government, but for whatever reason, it lay almost undiscovered, I think, in the library until I discovered it myself.
Great. And of course, both of us have received a conservatory training. You already mentioned as a pianist, I as a conductor. Speaking of Rachmaninoff research, do you feel it is an advantage that you are a performance musician yourself? You know the drill, the discipline, the doubts, difficulties.
Uh, Perhaps curiously, I didn't play any of Rachmaninoff's music until after the age of 30. I know that Rachmaninoff's music for pianists is very attractive. Students in their late teens and their early 20s. But knowing much more about Rachmaninoff's music now, I know that he wouldn't have played it in the way that some young pianists play it today. So I think that I had a lucky advantage in maybe being able to approach his music more from the musical point of view than the strictly pianistic point of view. So I'm grateful for that rather strange absence of his music in my early years.
Speaking about the performance diary itself and about programming itself, does it help you also the fact that you know about how it works in concerts?
It's very clear that over Rachmaninoff's life, he developed a very deep understanding of how to present music before the public. Initially, as many people know, his piano recitals consisted only of his music. In 1915, he introduced Scriabin's music after Scriabin's death. But upon emigrating, he realized that he needed to present a variety of music. And so to see how Rachmaninoff's programming choices evolved over a few decades. The music that he chose, the standard music that he chose that he knew that people would like, the music that was less known but which he wanted to highlight, the virtuosic works with which he sort of presumed that everybody wanted to hear his concerts end with, and a very judicious use of his own music, and of course perpetually plagued by that very well-known prelude that he wrote very early on.
What we have is a mix of sheet music, purchased or received, and at times scores bear handwritten dedications by composers, at times There's just a stamp saying complementary copy. But for most of the time, the condition of the material tells a lot.
And maybe if I can add to that, Elke, what I think is interesting is the way that the list of titles in the text version of the database that you've sent me so far invites us to speculate. And of course, speculate is often all we can do. But it's so intriguing to look at this collection of titles of the music that he had. However, looking at the list, it's impossible not to wonder what he might have been thinking of adding to his repertoire. So whether he purchased that music, if this is indeed the music that he purchased as opposed to the music that was sent to him as a complimentary copy, if he had pondered including that music and seeing the diversity of some of these titles, I think that that's very intriguing. But also we have a question, and that is the music there because of Rachmaninoff the pianist, or was the music of interest to him for Rachmaninoff the composer?
And of course, what we have in a way is circumstantial evidence.
Indeed. I think that any one of these more interesting titles would be the object of a good deal of detective work to try to find out a little bit more. One of the things that only occurred to me this morning was noticing in the collection Schubert's Fantasy in F minor for four hands. I only recalled that in the Library of Congress, not part of the collection of scores, but part of the collection of sketches, is an indication that there's a couple of pages of just the scherzo from that F minor fantasy. Now, I haven't looked at this myself, but of course, and again, this is where the speculation comes in. If that sketch is for a single piano, did he ponder the notion of maybe just excerpting that scherzo and creating a single piano arrangement for his concerts? And of course, that would be very intriguing.
There is another two piano work by Grieg in the collection, which actually has the handwriting of Natalie Rachmaninoff on it. And a few people who were among his intimate circle say that Rachmaninoff and his wife used to play duets. And we only know of one duet, of which Rachmaninoff famously said it's the only thing she knows, and that's the Italian polka. But in fact, Rachmaninoff's wife had a full conservatory training and even studied with someone as famous as Konstantin Igumnov. So she must have been a very capable pianist herself. And it's fascinating to see that Grieg score, because it's clear that both he and she used that.
That wouldn't surprise me at all. I can't imagine that they pass their time only playing one short polka.
Well, the simple answer to that is no. But we can assume that a large part was indeed kept. We digitized two collections. On the one hand, the New York City Cabinet collection, which was passed down within the family and was moved a few times. And on the other, the Sonar Cabinet collection, which remained at Sonar at all time. But it is precisely in this collection that he found various modern notes stating assessments of auction value. And the most bizarre of these concerns valuation of the score of Rimsky-Korsakov's Le Coq d'Or, which Rachmaninoff famously took out with him on his flight from Russia. And this valuation dryly states that it is a first edition, which would sell at $500. But because of Rachmaninoff's handwriting on it, it will sell at $4,000.
Well, this is the thing that we can't know. The notion that music after Rachmaninoff's death that might have been of particular value to pianists or other musicians who visited Sennar, and that music might have gone astray, so to speak, or monetized. This indeed, again, it's speculation, but it does go, though, to an interesting question. Looking at the database, I went through it and looked for every work that we know that he played in his programs. And there was a list of around 20 works which were quite prominent in his programs, for which there are no copies. Now, I looked at the dates that he played those, and almost all of them in America between 1919 and, well, up to the middle of the 1920s. Now, it might be that when they moved eventually into the smaller apartment at 505 West End Avenue, there was either a box of music that was lost, or maybe just in downsizing, not all music was kept. But certainly those really prominent works from the very earliest part of his career in the West, them not being in the collection certainly raises a question about what happened to them.
Mm-hmm. And do you presume that that Rachmaninoff already started to work on them in Scandinavia?
Indeed, it could be the case that, and it's not all of these works that were in Scandinavia, but it could, of course, be the case that certain pieces weren't taken from there, because that would have been quite an undertaking to carry a lot of music as well if he'd amassed that in that year that he was living there. Of course, the editions of composers like Bach and Beethoven, even Chopin and Schubert and Schumann were all highly edited back in the first part of the 20th century. To look at Bach's music and to see regularly tempo indications, metronome marks, dynamics, phrasing, fingering even, of course, to modern eyes, looks very strange. But of course, it was the pre-Urtext stage, so there was no choice. One wonders to what extent he would have been influenced by some of those markings. I recall early on in my career, a teacher telling me that even if you pretend that you're not going to obey the instructions that are there, it's impossible not to see them. I suppose it's a question of piano pedagogy as well as scholarship to consider that Rachmaninoff's interpretations were likely influenced by some of these editions. But to what extent, and then also noting that he had multiple editions sometimes of works such as Beethoven sonatas, that he would have likely have been looking at the differences and making comparisons and ultimately choosing his own interpretations.
I think that we often tend to forget that in Rachmaninoff's time, it was not so much the scholars who were important. The tradition was handed down from teacher to pupil. And what is clear to me when I look through the list is that names of the pupils of Beethoven at least frequently appear. And he also kept himself informed about more modern specialists such as Busoni or Schnabel for Beethoven. The fact that he had so many copies and was so selective in his choice of who the editor was, even if it was not an editor to the standards we have today, but certainly these editors had a high standing in their days.
And of course, we can't underestimate, rather, the value of that actual tradition. And I think here particularly of Anton Rubinstein and the historical concerts. For example, in regard to Chopin's B-flat minor piano sonata, numerous sources indicate that it was Rubinstein's tradition in the funeral march to begin the reprise very loudly and to do a diminuendo away from that, which of course was very notable in regard to Rachmaninoff's performances. I mean, it surprised many reviewers. But one might wonder also what even the slightly subconscious things that Rachmaninoff might have picked up from the way that pieces were played carried across just as strongly as any indication in a score might have influenced him 2 decades later.
What is important too, if you look at the list and also look at the programming of the historical concerts Anton Rubinstein gave, it lists about 130 works, 90 of which actually are in the collection, and some of them also quite unknown to this day, and actually all of the large scale works. So Rubinstein was very much at the top of Rachmaninoff's list.
Yes, and of course, Anton Rubinstein was quite prescient in the way that he highly regarded music of the Renaissance and the Baroque and included examples of that, which of course predated the early music movement by a number of decades.
In this regard, the scores unfortunately hardly reveal information of any substance, and even more rarely information that is not open to speculation. A good example is the case of Schumann's Arabesque, in which he noted his timing for the piece as about 5 minutes or so, which would seem quite a clip and close to the composer's, Schumann's, own metronome marking. But the frustrating thing is that we do not know if he just skipped several or all of the repeats. So we will never know.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Schumann Arabesque, because that was not part of his repertoire. So what that timing was in regard to, again, invites further speculation. Did he consider adding it to his repertoire? At that length of time, maybe a recording would have been possible. Maybe that's what the faster tempo was all about. But again, it's raising more questions than answers for us.
Rachmaninoff was very sparse also with fingerings. So it's only in a few instances, and just we really had to go through all the pages and look very well to find, oh yes, there's a pencil mark here. Those are fingerings, and they are really in isolated places. So I was wondering, what is your take on that? You have seen, of course, the collection at the Library of Congress.
At the Library of Congress, I've only seen a limited number of things. I remember looking at some of the orchestral scores and seeing his own conductor's markings, but they were quite rudimentary. They were quite the thing that you expected a conductor to mark, enlarging a time signature, for example, something that one wants to be able to see at a glance. It's very exciting to ponder that one of these scores might have something that we can really learn something from, especially in regard to interpretation or in regard to technique. But as you said, as you indicated about fingering, I mean, in Rachmaninoff's own music, only very rarely did he put fingering in, and it was only in exceptional cases where he came up with something that on first glance doesn't look all that good, but once you actually learn it at speed, turns out to be a little bit of genius. I think it's really interesting to wonder about this, because he was always adding to his repertoire. Even in the last couple of years of his life, he added the Schumann concerto, he added Beethoven's first piano concerto. he gave, I think it was just one performance of Schumann's Faschingsschwank aus Wien in only a few months before he died. So when we look, for example, at the inclusion of Brahms's Paganini variations, or Brahms's first piano sonata, Debussy's L'Île Joyeuse, which would have been a very interesting concert piece, and we know that he did play other works of Debussy and other French composers in his programs. Mozart, so there's two copies of the B-flat concerto K450, two copies with that a potential addition to his repertoire. The Schubert A major sonata Deutsch 959, and that's we know that Rachmaninoff in the last 2 decades, certainly the last decade of his life, was playing some really significant repertoire and getting extraordinary reviews for the power of his musical insight, such as Beethoven's Opus 111 Sonata. What might Rachmaninoff have made of something like Schubert's second last sonata? And then, you know, the works Russian composers of his generation. One just wonders what he might have been considering as potential things to add.
There are things you really can see from the scores, deduct from the scores. For instance, the fact that because Rachmaninoff was a heavy smoker, his fingers were full of nicotine. So you can easily find out whether Rachmaninoff used the score frequently or not, because it's all yellow at the page turns. The other thing is also the fact that you already mentioned, for instance, with the Mozart piano concerto, he had 2 copies. So that shows evident interest in the score. And we do not know exactly why this interest was, but the interest is very evident. And of course, whenever there is, just as in case of the Schumann arabesque, whenever there is a tempo indication, or fingerings, you also know that he is closely involved with a piece. But we will never know if scores that he didn't work through, or that are hardly touched, whether he seriously pondered them or just got them as a complementary copy or something else, and didn't bother to look at them too seriously. We will never know that. So that's pure speculation, of course, but it's really a fascinating thought sometimes.
It's a lot of fun.
Well, that's difficult to say, for me at least, because the copies are at the Library of Congress, and they all of them were published by Arthur P. Schmidt. So it might concern complementary copies as well. So that's difficult for me to say. We know that Rachmaninoff, as a composer, took a great interest in any young composer who approached him with some serious questions or for advice. And this is because he came from a tradition in which composers often used to meet at soirees and play through their own works to introduce them to their peers, and at times even in unfinished form.
The Russian tradition of playing music to each other, which continued during Soviet times as well, was something that Rachmaninoff missed. I looked again at Sofia Satina's essay in Vos Pomerania, Memories, the 2 volumes, and came immediately upon a paragraph where she was talking about how much he missed those interactions once he had left Russia. So the inclusion of music of people like Abram Chassans, I think, is an indication of a genuine interest. And we know that Rachmaninoff played through Chassin's piano concerto with him to help him.
Exactly.
So it's perhaps logical to think that he had an interest, an abiding interest in this music. In regards to MacDowell and Amy Beach, I mean, we know that there's a very nasty reference to MacDowell in one of the
Exactly.
letters where he dismisses one of the piano concertos. But I'm more persuaded that he might have genuinely liked Amy Beach's music, even just at a very short first acquaintance. Only that it's part of the harmonic world that he was most familiar with. But then, you know, thinking that these two American scores are in the Library of Congress collection, one has to also wonder whether there was perhaps a bit of thinking about what to represent in that publicly held collection, whether it seemed like a good idea that America was at least slightly represented in Rachmaninoff's library repertoire.
I think that to pose a question is to answer it. So what do you think?
I think that some works that he knew from his youth, and this is based on the acknowledgement from numerous sources that he had an extraordinary memory. I think there were some works that he knew so well that he probably didn't feel the need to have a copy of it. For example, the Troika from Tchaikovsky's Seasons, which he'd played since when he was a child. I don't think he really needed a copy of that. One might wonder, heavens, didn't he at times want to look at the scores of Tchaikovsky's Fourth and Fifth Symphonies, which he'd conducted back in Russia? But perhaps he deeply thought he knew these works. You know, music is a sound. The thing that we have on paper is only the intermediary. You know, the piece of music was really in his heart. Maybe the printed copy was not so important. But again, we can only speculate and speculate further about whether or not there were copies. I mean, maybe there was a copy of Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony or something like that with Rachmaninoff's signature on it, and it was monetized. I mean, again, we can only speculate. I think another point to perhaps mention is that, of course, it was a different time and a different audience. Some Russian works, which we see as mainstays of the repertoire now, were not then. There was a time that Rachmaninoff included Balakirev's Islame as a concert closer. It was only in one season, and I've read quite a number of reviews, and most of them were very dismissive. They didn't know the music. They didn't see it as important music. Of course, today, young pianists would flock to hear Rachmaninoff play Balakirev's Islame.
I would certainly have liked to make more of it, but the condition of write these scores tell us that they were seldomly used.
Yes, I'm not surprised. I still wonder though whether there was at one stage just an inkling of an idea, knowing that Stravinsky had written 4 etudes as his Opus 7. Maybe he thought this would be possible. A short glance, I think, would have shown him that there was no need to look further because it wasn't his type of music. The works of Shostakovich that are there, I think, are more interesting. The Three Fantastic Dancers, very early works of Shostakovich. I think Rachmaninoff would have given very charming performances of the collection of the 24 preludes as well that is there. Maybe one or two of those could have been potential additions. But again, as you've indicated, and this is the knowledge that you have and that I'm jealous of, you can tell which of these works have been thumbed through and played quite a bit and which of these really don't look as if they've been used at all. And in regard to Prokofiev, there's a very interesting work there, which is The Prodigal Son, the ballet.
Yes, exactly. And that's also why it still fascinates me. And just as you were mentioning this about the Shostakovich, of course, Rachmaninoff knew these fantastic dances because he decided to, according to Sophia Seton, he decided to call his last work not fantastic dances, but symphonic dances because as Sophia Sutton says, Shostakovich had already written a work called Fantastic Dances. My answer may be disappointing on one hand, but there's still the sense that you might think of probable reasons for Rachmaninoff to be interested in the works of these composers, and especially in their orchestrations. In the finale of the third symphony, you have a passage that is where there's a combination of sounds which is actually found in the Sacre du Printemps of Stravinsky. So that's very interesting. And Rachmaninoff also famously said about Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony that Shostakovich was highly talented, and he must have said that for a reason.
Yes, and I think that just going back to the Prokofiev, the ballet score that we mentioned, The Prodigal Son, I think that's very much, I mean, clearly it's Rachmaninoff, the composer, who's looking at that. And so we can discern, the different levels of interest, the Rachmaninoff, the pianist, or Rachmaninoff, the composer, in terms of some of these works that are in his collection. I think it's interesting that he has the music of this number of composers who were contemporaries when he was a student at the Moscow Conservatory. I suppose it's natural that people that you grow up with, part of your generation, so to speak, that you maintain an interest. What I think is worth commenting on, though, in regard to all of these composers that were in the list that you just mentioned, is I think without exception, they all left Russia, like Rachmaninoff. Emil Frey, I understand, went back to Switzerland. Gavrilovich was in the US. Malashevsky, who you just mentioned, went back to Poland after the revolution. Vladimir Pol also, I'm not quite sure whether it was the US, but he certainly left Russia. And Bortkiewicz as well. And of course, Gretchaninov, who was slightly older generation. So, there might have also been a sort of nostalgic connection there as well to see this music of not only his contemporaries, but friends and contemporaries who faced the same situation about where to be after 1917.
In the case of a score we found of the Aquarelle by Gretchaninov, a work which, to my recollection, Rachmaninoff never played in public. On the score, he notes the address details of Gretchaninov just in brief telegram style. So he really was at least eager to react by mail or else how to the reception of this score.
I think we could perhaps make a similar comment, although not for the same reasons, about Glazunov, who he was in contact with and who he helped when Glazunov left Russia and went to Paris. But interestingly, there's very little Glazunov music in Rachmaninoff's collection. The history with Glazunov goes back, of course, a long way, and the premiere of the First Symphony and whether its failure was to do with the conductor, which I think Natalia Rachmaninoff was in print in saying that it was. So yes, curious.
The score Rachmaninoff had of Glazunov's music was signed by Glazunov himself. There were certain works that continued to fascinate Rachmaninoff. The Rimsky-Korsakov scores, which he brought from Russia, are clear examples. And the same would go for Bizet's Carmen, which famously, by the testimony of several witnesses, Rachmaninoff used to play through for himself or friends. what surprises me most actually is that there is a heavily thumbed score of Verdi's Falstaff that also appears to have been used really often. And I didn't know about that one. Did you?
No, that is very interesting to think of his interest in Verdi. But we know how close opera was to Rachmaninoff's heart. And his first professional work as a conductor with the Mamontoff Company was opera, and he got to know very interesting cornerstone works of the Russian repertoire. And then, of course, with the Bolshoi, he had a dreadful disappointment with his own two single-act operas. Um, I think the decision to leave the Bolshoi and to go to Dresden for a couple of years was deeply connected with that. But of course, then there were other operatic projects, and of course Monavana, which he was dreadfully disappointed that he couldn't use because of the copyright issues. Metalenk had already assigned the copyright to another composer. So the notion of what opera is, this great form of musical theatre, I think had a really deep interest for him. But looking at what's there, I mean, there's two copies of the Magic Flute, for example, of Mozart. La Bohème of Puccini, a very successful opera. I imagine that this is very much Rachmaninoff, the composer, perhaps trying to see more of what the secrets of these works are. But then there's something that's very bizarre, which is, considering that the Hopak from Sorochinsky Fair was so much played for him. That's not there by Mussorgsky. Boris is not there. Of course, Rachmaninoff had conducted that. But Mussorgsky's first attempt at an opera, The Marriage, a very obscure and very bizarre work. This was when the nationalist school in St. Petersburg decided that to write true Russian opera, one had to capture the inflection of the language perfectly. Now, Mussorgsky himself gave up on that opera. He thought that it was taking the experiment too far. The nature of Rachmaninoff's vocal writing that one sees in his songs is actually very much of the St. Petersburg school, where he prioritizes the natural declamation of the words above just beautiful melody, let's say. Sometimes he gives the beautiful melody to the piano. So what the interest was there in this work and how he got a copy of it as well, I find really quite extraordinary.
Rachmaninoff's roots were not so much as a pianist, but as a vocal composer. Of course, he listened so much to the singing, the Russian Orthodox Church singing in his youth, and it was even, and you can see that from the also from the inventory. There are two sizable and very rare volumes of original Russian church chants, and which seem to have been taken out of Russia at a certain point, perhaps even in 1917. We won't know, but certainly before before 1925. Rachmaninoff had a very close connection with words and music, with images, words and music. His songs work like a diary, even at times. So that is a very important thing to consider, I think, also.
I think that the two volumes that you mentioned, I think that they're of great interest, both, as you say, for the connection with his youth, with his grandmother going to church services. So to think that these two books of Russian religious music were there, that they were old copies, and then to speculate further about their provenance. How did he get them? How did he get them out of Russia? Were they taken in 1917, for example? But then there's another observation, and that is that of his All-Night Vigil, Opus 37, there's a number of copies, but there's two Russian copies one of which dates from 1915, the other one dates from 1922. They're the publication dates. So the questions about the provenance of those are, was it a contact who sent them to him? Was it somebody coming from Russia who brought that for him? We know that in I think it was 25, their maid, Masha or Marina was her name, was able to come out of Russia and visit the Rachmaninoffs in Dresden for only a couple of weeks. Sadly, only a year or so before she died. But one wonders, whether it was a contact like that might have brought things. Sophia Satina says that Masha in her room, and she didn't have much space, but she had chests of Rachmaninoff's belongings. She saw them as being sacred. Rachmaninoff and Natalia were writing to her saying, just sell this stuff, make some money for yourself so that you can survive. So there's always going to be question. Again, we're just left speculating about the provenance of those. But to tie it back, Elke, to the question that we started talking about, which was opera, I don't think we can forget about the very important relationship with Shaliapin. This was the formative stage for both of them when Shaliapin was just starting his career singing roles with the Mamontov opera. And I believe that Rachmaninoff taught Shaliapin those roles, and there was a great mutual love between them. Only a year or two before Shaliapin's death, Shaliapin was asked in an interview who the great Russian singers are of today, and he said Rachmaninoff. Well, as a pianist, I'm embarrassed because I never did those exercises. I was never made to study Czerny. I was never made to study Hanon. So I didn't have this repertoire. But from what I understand that you've mentioned, and seeing also just in the database, there's numerous copies of Czerny that they are very well thumbed. That they were exercises that he kept at. And there's the occasional reference to people hearing Rachmaninoff practice. And we know that he did do these exercises, that they were very important for him. But I suppose this is me more speculating on a personal level. I don't know whether Rachmaninoff's phenomenal technique really needed these exercises, whether it might have been a little bit of self-doubt that he felt that he had to play them. But I think it's educational to say nothing more than that he had these things and he practiced them.
One of the things that I find at least very remarkable as a characteristic of Rachmaninoff's attitude to pianism is, of course, that he worked so hard. He had such a talent, but he worked so hard to really get the optimum. And you can even hear that, of course, not always to the best effect in his recordings, which sometimes are not always as spontaneous as people said his performances actually were. So he was quite a perfectionist. When I saw one of the first movies of him, the family part of the family movies, it's a famous place where you have his hand and he does these incredible exercises with his fingers, and he does this very slowly, So he was really obsessed with that, I think, and the fact that he also told Ruth Slenzinska, who came the child prodigy, who came to him for advice. He told her, never play with spaghetti fingers. Perhaps we should find someone to talk about that who has perhaps even a Russian schooling.
Well, I was just about to say that I think that a lot of his ideas about how to play the piano go back to Zverev, his teacher back in Moscow. There's a number of accounts of Zverev, who is not really regarded as a great, or having had a great career as an artist himself, but as a pedagogue, as a teacher. He was held in such high esteem. And I think that it's likely that Rachmaninoff carried the good advice about how to play the piano from then throughout his life. But to comment just what you mentioned about whether or not the recordings really represent Rachmaninoff in his best light, we know from Sophia Saturner that when he was recording his concertos, that he didn't feel that he could ask to do another take, and especially something like the first and the fourth piano concerto recordings, which were not going to be money earners for the company. He didn't feel that he could sort of say, "Oh, can we do this again?" We know that with his solo recording, he was much more particular and destroyed almost all of the takes that he didn't want people to hear. But I'm reminded that Horowitz, who of course had heard Rachmaninoff live and knew him personally, he said that there was only one recording in which he felt Rachmaninoff's greatness, both as an artist and in terms of the spontaneity of the musical performance. And he referred to the slow movement of the first piano concerto. And it's funny, after reading that, I went back and listened to that again. And, that opening statement of the slow movement of the first piano concerto is extraordinary. So what Rachmaninoff was capable of in concerts compared to what we have on record. And we know, he didn't enjoy the recording process like many people. As soon as it was time to record, there's nerves that kick in. So we'll we will only ever forever wonder what some of the great performances of his really were like. I found it very interesting that the scherzo from A Midsummer Night's Dream of Mendelssohn, within Rachmaninoff's library, there was another piano transcription that predated his own. Ernest Hutchinson, who actually has a connection, he was an Australian, but he did a transcription of that in 1921, and Rachmaninoff had a copy. And I also noticed that Kreisler, of course, created his own solo piano arrangements of Liebeslied and Liebesfreude. And Rachmaninoff had both of those. And I think that one might speculate from that these works, which became very famous transcriptions by him, at least there was a starting point that he had something on paper of how it would work for piano first. I found that just intriguing. But then I thought, really, I don't know how much can be read into it. There's that famous, very early orchestral work that Rachmaninoff wrote, a scherzo, which on first hearing of it, you realize this is very much in the style of Mendelssohn. It's in the same time signature as the scherzo. Heavens, is it in the same key? No, I don't think it is. It's in D minor. But I think that the way that Mendelssohn's Mendelssohn's orchestral music worked on the piano was something that Rachmaninoff already knew. So I'm not necessarily convinced that those copies that I just mentioned had any great bearing on what Rachmaninoff was to later do with them. I just note them as interest.
It at least shows how well he documented himself whenever approaching anything. One of the most fascinating things about the transcriptions he made in the West is that they are inspired actually by pieces Kreisler had in his repertoire, and pieces that Kreisler even transcribed or used himself. Actually, the Liebeslied and the Liebesfreude work in the same way. It's just like he's commenting and giving musical signs to his friend Fritz Kreisler.
Yes, I agree with that. I think especially Liebesfreud, I mean, it's so wonderfully overwritten. I mean, Kreisler, of course, was a very capable pianist himself. There's even recordings of Kreisler playing the piano. But I think that it's almost a little bit tongue-in-cheek, Rachmaninoff sort of saying, well, you think you know piano playing, have a look at this. It's very clear that Rachmaninoff had very deep respect for Kreisler. And what's interesting, I mean, many people presume that they played together in concert quite a lot. I mean, Sattner actually believed that they never performed together. I managed to find a concert in 1911 in England where they did actually play together. But that, as far as we can tell, is the only time. They were both on the same program, but not together, just as both as soloists.
That performance in England before the World War was indeed a performance where they played one piece together, the Schubert one. So that's very interesting.
I think it's interesting to consider that the early music movement evolved slowly. I mean, we made a reference in conversation before to the prescience of Anton Rubinstein, including early music, but and of course, this was in the early 1890s, if it wasn't the late 1880s. Many people credit the early music movement with Wanda Landowska, who had play or build a harpsichord for her first in 1909. It was only in the 1920s that she had even bigger harpsichords built and was touring and doing concerts, especially in America. But to see Rachmaninoff incorporating early music into his programs as the opening number in his recitals, I think is interesting. Quite early on, there's Bach, but it's usually transcriptions of organ works by Busoni and people like that. One sees, though, then, for example, there's a work by Gluck that starts to appear in an arrangement by Saint-Saëns, admittedly, that appears in programs in 1924 or 1925. But then to see, you know, a few years later, the inclusion of for example, Rameau's Gavotte and Variations, and to read reviews of those concerts where people indicate that Rachmaninoff made the piano sound like a harpsichord. The Rachmaninoff was aiming for what was at least slightly informed knowledge to capture that in the sound of a piano. I think that's very interesting. I mean, looking at it another way, I think it's a very easy way to begin a program. With early music that's not demanding, knowing also that in his American concert tours, some of the venues that he played in would never have had a second piano backstage, and Rachmaninoff's warming up, so to speak, was on stage. So this early music repertoire was a good opportunity, I suppose, for that. But at the same time, I see Rachmaninoff's music as having, you know, just being one small step in the gradual progression of what then became a real force in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s with an interest in early music and performing it in a way that's historically appropriate.
I think that his connection with the Baroque actually also shows, for instance, in the Etude Tableau Opus 39, number 4, and also even at the start of the Chopin variations, which combine techniques on the one hand by Chopin, on the other by Bach, and in the end by Schumann. So it's very interesting to look at that aspect. But the Baroque music played a large role, and you can see that in the inventory, just how many works of Bach were included in this inventory.
It is very interesting, especially when one looks at the works by J.S. Bach, what is there. I mean, there's 2 complete copies of the World Tempered Clavier plus an extra copy of just the first book. Perhaps you can tell me, though, to what extent have those the well-tempered clavier, the preludes and fugues, to what extent have they looked, or do they look as if they've been played frequently?
They were used quite often, not as frequently as, for instance, the Czarny etudes that he had at Sonar, which is all over the place. It just falls apart before your eyes. But the fact even that he had 2 copies of the well-tempered clavier already shows you that he had an evident interest in these.
Of course, there's only one prelude, and we don't know whether it's book 1 or book 2, but it's D minor, that he ever included in a program. I mean, of course, there's the partita, I think it's number 4. There's also a couple of movements from one of the English suites that he included in programs. But the well-tempered clavier, nothing except for that one time that there was one prelude. But I'm not surprised. I mean, and again, this is not really even thinking of Rachmaninoff the pianist, but Rachmaninoff the composer. How could you look at those works and not be intrigued?
Exactly. And what is important, I think, to note is, of course, that Zilotti was one of the people, together with Sergei Kusevitsky, who really championed Bach in the first decade of the 20th century in Russia.
Talking about Zilotti, I think it's interesting. I noted that the Totentanz of Liszt is not there, and Rachmaninoff only performed it once. It was in the late 30s. And there's a letter where he writes that it has to be made very, very clear in the program that Rachmaninoff is using the edition of Zilotti. But yet there's no copy of it there.
What might be important, of course, is to know that that there may well have been some exchange of scores between the Zilotti and Rachmaninoff families. Both were very close to each other, and not just during Rachmaninoff's time, but also after that.
Yes, well, of course, geographically they ended up being quite close as well.
Exactly. So so there is any possibility that material, of course, that we haven't found may be actually may be in the hands of the Zilotti family without them knowing it.
Indeed. Continuing on with Zilotti, there is that edition of the Liszt B minor sonata of Zilotti that's in the collection, and there's a note. I saw there was a note that there's some pages that have been clipped together, which would perhaps indicate that it was thinking about some sort of cut. Yet at the same time, it was after when Rachmaninoff played that in concert. It was only for 20 or so concerts in 1924 that Rachmaninoff played Liszt's B minor sonata, but I think that Zilotti edition is from the 1930s. But again, just the existence of it there and the speculation about a paperclip, it leads one to wonder. There's a lot of intrigue, Elke, in this database that you and Walter have put together.
This is why we are so excited that it finally goes to all the world to see.
It's great scholarship. You've done a really tremendous job. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for all your comments this day. It's a real pleasure to talk with you. And the talk has not ended, we know.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you for asking me.